Coming to Think Tank. Today we're grateful to have Cole Monnahan give a talk entitled Toward a Modern Bayesian Workflow for Fisheries Stock Assessments. Cole Monnahan works as a quantitative ecologist at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center. Okay, Cole, you can take it away.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks everyone for coming. I think this is my first time using GoToMeeting, so somebody yell at me if I'm doing something wrong. I think I'll maybe turn my webcam off for now, just and pull it back up toward the end when we're having more of a discussion. So yeah, thanks Emily and UW staffs for hosting. This is a project I've been working on for quite a few years now. It actually was kind of part of my dissertation work at Quorum, I guess 5 or 6 years ago now, and it's kind of a piece and extension I've always wanted to work on, and this was a really great excuse and deadline for me to make a push on that. So yeah, let me jump in. Oops. I guess I should maybe caveat this with I remember UW think tanks as being very informal, and I like that. So I want this to be kind of, interrupt me, and also don't have expectations that this is a super polished talk because I finished it about 20 minutes ago. So yeah, please interrupt, and I will do my best to get through this. I haven't really practiced it, but it's quite a lot of information, so hold on, but we'll get through it and hopefully have a nice discussion along the way and at the end. So just to start us off here, there's been a long history in Bayesian fisheries with Bayesian fisheries stock assessments. Starting back in the 90s with bugs, or kind of the canonical example is this Meyer and Miller. It was fitted to a tuna stock. And then since then, there's been a lot of development on like data limited and data moderate approaches that use Bayesian inference as well. A little bit less common is Bayesian inference for what I call full age or size structured integrated model. This is your stock synthesis or GMAX, or these integrated models where we have different data sources in our that we're fitting to. There are obviously some exceptions to that. A really interesting one to me is red rock lobster in New Zealand. Merrill Rudd and co-authors there have been using Stan, the software platform Stan, for quite a few years now, and successfully. And I find that really fascinating because that's the only example I know of somebody actually doing an assessment for management in Stan, which is pretty cool. More close to home, the Pacific Hake Group uses stock synthesis, which is an ADMB model. They use it pretty exclusively, well, not exclusively, but a lot for that, for management, that is. But there's also some other uses, like some stocks will use it just as kind of like looking at diagnostics, or like run it to make a single figure. And that's true, I know, at least for a lot of AFSC, Alaska Center stocks, including the Gulf of Alaska pollock stock, which uses runs it and then looks at probability depletion for something that's not important. And I'll come back to that stock a lot as kind of one of my main case studies for this talk. And that's just to say, there's a lot of really good work that has been done and continues to be done. So I'm hoping to add to that, and at least for today, I'm focusing on data-rich, what I call integrated models in the Fourier sense of things. So kind of where we are now is, there's been some really important advances in numerical techniques in the last decade or so, and probably the biggest one that I can think of is the creation or publication of what's called the no U-turn sampler, the NUTS algorithm by Hoffman and Gelman. And that has really caused a real big shift in the broader applied statistics community. I'd be shocked if Stan is not easily the most dominant software platform now for Bayesian inference. Back in our paper, I guess it was in like 2017 or something, we did a citation analysis, and it was kind of interesting. Bugs and win bugs and open bugs were all had all peaked. Jags was kind of still on the way up, and Stan was, the newest of the ones we looked at, and it was just like exponential, it was skyrocketing. So I would expect that to be true. And so part of the work I did previously was to take that nuts algorithm and make it available to ADMB and TMB models. And Casper and I did this in 2 different R packages. AD-nuts is for ADMB. And the way that works, just to be clear, because I get this question a lot, and I think there's a lot of misunderstanding. The algorithm itself for ADMB is built into the source code. So when you download and install ADMB, all the nuts capabilities are in the source code. So when you compile your model, it gets basically merged into your model, or your model gets merged into the ADMB source code and compiled, and so that's there. There's an R package, AD-nuts, which does a lot of, which I recommend using, and does a lot of processing and running, but it's not doing any of the actual work. The algorithm itself is implemented in C++ on the kind of the back end of ADMB. And TMB is quite different. So Casper is the one that developed and continues to develop and maintain TMB Stan. That's a little bit different. He basically took the C++ code from TMB and spliced it into a Stan model. So when you run it, you are actually running RStan, and it's just pulling the gradient and objective function information from your template, your CPP file, I guess your DLL file, on the fly. And so one of the really interesting things about that is as RStan evolves and they make bug fixes or model and algorithm advances, that automatically comes along into TMB Stan. ADMB nuts is not true because I had to code it myself. So if there's some new development in nuts or some other Bayesian algorithm, somebody would have to go into ADMB source code and modify that. So kind of a key distinction. Everything I'm going to talk to you about today, almost everything is basically the same in TMB. So and I'm going to focus primarily on ADMB just because most of our stock assessments are still in ADMB. But as we move into TMB with packages like WAM and SAM and others, I think there'll be more interest in doing these things in TMB Stan. And I'll highlight some of the differences throughout, and happy to take questions about the 2 packages and differences at any point as well. So kind of moving on to the big topic here, important advances in what's called a Bayesian workflow. They're not just some numerical advances that have been important in kind of the broader, what I call applied stats field. There's also been a lot of thought a little bit on, to a large degree, the kind of the philosophy of how we do these analyses. And in the literature, this is called a Bayesian workflow. So, I think Michael Betancourt is probably one of the leading proponents of this. He has a really good case study. It's very long and extensive, but really good write-up of this online on his writing webpage. But there's also some papers that are kind of in the works. There's some archive papers like this Bayesian workflow from, led by Andrew Gelman. Has a lot of good information and summarizes kind of the current thinking about best practices for how to conduct Bayesian analysis. And they actually mentioned in the paper they're working on a book, so that'll be really interesting to see come out. But there's some other components to it. So like visualization, kind of what's the role of visualization, making an argument for how important that is and how that should be done. And then a couple papers. So in cognitive science and disease transmission, there's a couple papers that kind of lay out translating this bigger picture advice into the nuance of a specific field. So cognitive science or disease modeling. So that's, I think what spurred me to think about doing this talk and think about this for our field, that is, stock assessments, integrated stock assessments, is, there's been a lot of really good movement in thinking on how we do these things better. And I don't see it being taken up in our field. And so that's something that I want to try to push on a little bit. And that's the idea behind this workshop. So let's define it. So Gelman defines it. First, let's define a generative model. This is a joint probability distribution of data and parameters, and that we can simulate data from it. And in his paper, he makes this distinction, and I think it's really worth bringing up front here and being clear about. There's, I think Bayesian inference and data analysis and workflow are often used interchangeably, but there are some subtle differences. So Bayesian inference does not require a generative model. And this is not super important for our field, but I do think, because we do have generative models, but I do think it's an interesting example. So he gives an example of a data set where you've maybe flipped a coin n times and you have, X heads or something like that. In order to do inference on the probability of a heads, you don't actually need to specify fully what the likelihood is. And the example he gives is it could be either a negative binomial or it could be a binomial, and the inference itself on that parameter will be identical because those likelihoods are the same up to a constant with respect to the data. But the problem is that, so you could actually do inference on that, right, and get answers and have posteriors and all of that. But it's not technically a generative model because we can't simulate from it. We haven't specified the data generating process. And so the way that Gelman et al. Refer to data analysis is that it is required for requires a generative model for predictive simulation and model checking. And then a Bayesian workflow extends that, where we're gonna basically do Bayesian data analysis on a series of generative models, and that's how they define a workflow. And I think, taking a step back, in our field, we do this pretty well, I think. If we can jump ahead here, we have generative models. I think every assessment I've seen, so that data generating process is explicit and we could simulate from them. So I don't think that's necessarily a problem. And I think we're also good at exploring and investigating a series of models, certainly in a review panel, but even just in a normal stock assessment cycle, we might investigate a handful of different structures or variants of a model. And so, yeah, we have this, we have a series of generative models that we're looking at and kind of investigating and see how they behave. So that's already like a huge step toward a kind of a modern Bayesian workflow. But I would argue that many of those components are missing or they're done inconsistently. And I think as a field, what I'm hoping to push on here is that we should agree on what a modern workflow looks like. And so that's really my primary goal today, is to introduce some of these tools that have been developed in the literature and how we can bring them into our field with its nuances and its idiosyncrasies, and how can we develop and kind of come to an agreement of what are the best practices for doing data-rich Bayesian assessments, and hopefully to extend that to moderate and all sorts of other ones as well. I guess maybe put simply, like I think we're beyond the point where you can just fit your model and then at the end say dash MCMC, a million, then 1,000, and look at traces, which I think our field has been more or less been doing for several decades now. And the time for that is over, in my opinion. So let's redefine what that looks like and see what people think. So I guess before we do that, it's the big question is, do we even need Bayesian inference? I guess the really obvious answer is no. We're, I think, successfully managing a lot of stocks without it. But In some cases, it does change management advice. Ian Stewart led a paper in, I don't know, 2014 or so. I should have cited it, looking at that for a couple models in the US West Coast. And I just want to highlight that, when we do frequentist models, we're assuming everything is asymptotically normal. That's parameters and derived quantities. Think of all the approximations and assumptions that go into the delta method. And not everything is normal. That's not always true. And I would say when it is, that's great. You're going to get the same answer. You have really informative data relative to the complexity of your model. And if that does come out to be the same, I think you can have more confidence in your model. And I think that's a good thing. I guess I would pose, do we want to restrict ourselves only to, essentially multivariate normal approximately models? Maybe as a field, maybe there's some advantages to that. I don't think so. Happy to have that broader discussion. But my main point, I suppose, is that I'm arguing not that we should switch over to using Bayesian inference or a Bayesian workflow for all of our management needs. What I'm saying is that it's a really important tool in our toolkit, and that when we can use it and do use it, if we adopt, what we call a modern Bayesian workflow, I argue strongly that it provides you deeper insights into your model. And though that helps you guide model development and model checking, and that leads to more stable, more understood and more stable models, and therefore more robust inference. So that's kind of where we're going here. I'm not arguing for everybody to switch. What I'm arguing for is, I think everybody should try to do it once and see what comes out of your model. Okay, so this is a little out of place, but I want to get it up front here because I'm going to show some results throughout, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. So regarding convergence diagnostics, this is something that people always talk about in the STAN world, STAN being the software implementation. They basically only look at, for the most part, in most cases, two different diagnostics. The first is RHAT, known as the potential scale reduction factor. This was introduced by Gelman and Rubin a long time ago. There've been some really important recent advances. Atari et al. Just not last year, 2 years ago, made some major improvements to it. And this is coded in the RSTAN diagnostic. The RSTAN package has these new methods in it. So I would encourage people to stop using CODA to calculate RHAT. That's old and outdated. There's really no reason not to switch to STAN that I can tell. You can plug JAG's output in STAN and get improved RHAT estimates. And kind of bottom line, I propose that we want the maximum RHAT. That is, we have an RHAT for each parameter, and taking the maximum across all parameters, we want that to be less than 1.01. The second one, diagnostic that's typically tracked and used, is effective sample size. And the idea here is we need enough posterior samples for inference. That is our kind of numerical integration. And note that, to estimate a median is a lot easier. We need fewer samples than to estimate a tail probability. So if you want to know the 99th percentile of terminal spawning biomass, you're going to need a lot of effective samples, right? If you just want to know the mean, a couple hundred is going to be sufficient. So I think a nice sweet spot is that we want the minimum effective sample size, that's across parameters, to be probably greater than 200 for most purposes, and ideally no divergences. And when I say for most purposes, I mean for inference, and we can come back to this at the end. For model development and kind of pilot modeling, I think you can get away with much shorter chains. But when I say, this is for inference. Divergences are a no-U-turn sample thing. I don't know if probably won't go into that too much today. So you'll see this come through a couple times throughout actually on the slides. This is output from R from using the ADNets package, so using ADMB model. And so you can notice, if you just kind of print the summary to the console after you fit the model, I've condensed it down so you can see how long it took. And then these two things, minimum effective sample size, 788. I would definitely use that for inference. And then the maximum R hat is 1.003. So both of these conditions are pretty easily satisfied for this particular one. We'll see examples where they're not in just a second. I guess one thing just to say about ESS is percentage here. This is percent of like the total that it could be. So if you have, say, 1,000 post warm-up samples, that would be percentage of that. This is the percentage of out of 1,000. And that's helpful to know because, 788 is a lot if you only have 1,000. It's not that much if you have 100,000. So that percentage gives you a sense of also of how well it's mixing. I think a lot of people, maybe not the new the students, but some of the the older folks will wonder about some of the other, there's diagnostics, there's like burn-in diagnostics, and there's all sorts of things. As far as I can tell, nobody seems to use those anymore because it's basically all wrapped up in R hat. It's pretty hard to have a good R hat if like your warm-up's not long enough or you have some other problems. So it's kind of a superset, if that makes sense, of convergence diagnostic tools. So if you use STAN, these R hat and ESS are calculated automatically. If you use Shiny STAN, those are kind of the two main things that are highlighted and used to determine if there's any signs for non-convergence. But I also want to stress that especially R hat is designed to be run with multiple chains and have those chains start at different initial values, which we typically fail to do in our field. Okay. So maybe Emily, can I just check in? Is there anything in the chat, questions in the chat?
Yes, I have one from Jim Ianelli. What's okay, never mind. It was what's the 15.76%? Is it good? I guess that's the question.
Yeah, so you want this to be close. You can see my pointer, right, Emily?
Yes.
Yeah, ideally this would be close to 100, and that would indicate very low autocorrelation, essentially. This isn't like an absolute measure, and this is like of autocorrelation, and this is like a relative measure. So if your chains are really autocorrelated, this is going to go to 0, but you could just run it longer and still have a high effective sample size. So this is relative and this is absolute.
Okay. Oh, hold on. Jim also asks, can you have a good effective sample size in R hat, but not have a good explored posterior?
Yeah, I think there's going to be some pathological cases, especially if you start from the mode, which we typically do in our assessments. But R hat, and especially these new versions, when you run with multiple chains, are very sensitive to those. So it's going to pick up on any sort of, it's very sensitive to any issues like that. But certainly, we want to always run multiple chains. I will not ever stop talking about this. There is no argument between multiple chains or one longer chain because we should all be running multiple long chains. You have multiple cores. It's trivial to do in R now. Please do not run one chain. So there probably are some pathological cases, but you'll find in practice and this is for stock assessments, synthesis models, whatever, that R hat very quickly picks up on issues and it's very specific to parameters too. So you might have, let's keep in mind, like I'm saying the maximum R hat and the minimum ESS, there's a distribution, I have 336 parameters here, I have 336 effective sample sizes. And you might have that all of them are really high except for one, and it's, it's effective sample size of 4 or something like that, which is, not nearly enough to do any sort of inference. And so not only are they sensitive, but they'll point you toward which part of the model is struggling to mix. And I have, we have a paper on this a few years ago, kind of looking at some of those issues. And I'm not going to talk really much at all about kind of nuts and how to run it and diagnose it. I want to focus on some of the other pieces that we as a field, I think, don't pay attention to enough. But I want to say this is what we're kind of looking for these throughout the talk, and then we'll come back to this at the end when we have a broader discussion about what should those numbers be. Is 1.01 and 200 good enough? Let's hold that for later. So I think, moving forward into some of these pieces of a modern analysis, not a modern workflow, that is, I think we really just need to start with priors, because I think that's where most of the action happens. So I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about priors. And I want to, acknowledge that, in the literature, in our literature, there's, I dare say, a long history of being distrustful of priors and dismissing, the need to specify them as a disadvantage of a Bayesian analysis. And I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think we should try to reframe our thoughts on priors. And here's just some quotes from those papers I showed earlier that kind of highlight that. So as part of a conceptual framework, Gelman et al. Talk about this ladder, which I think this is very obvious, and to anybody who's worked at this, a flat prior, an improper flat prior has, less information that is super vague, but proper prior, and kind of walk through the different kind of tiers of priors, and ending with a specific informative prior. And so, they talk about using improper priors as like placeholders or steps along the road to a fully Bayesian model. And I think some people in the past or currently have argued that, well, we can't really specify priors for everything, so we shouldn't do Bayesian analysis. And these people are pushing back on that, right? So the second quote here by Michael, I think is really interesting, right? It's expensive and time-consuming, and ultimately an iterative process to elicit domain expertise, right? Like, if we want a prior for Q or something, we might have to do an expensive, a field study or something like that. And so in practice, he recommends we kind of start with a rough elicitation and hope that it's good enough. And if it's not, then we can go back and elicit more precise information. And so there's kind of an iterative process going on here. Third one here, which I think is from Gelman, kind of in bold here, we don't need our model to capture every last detail of our knowledge. It should just not outright conflict with that knowledge. And so this is kind of the philosophy that this group of statisticians are putting forward. And so, sorry, my personal interpretation of this is that not having informative priors on all parameters is not an excuse to avoid a Bayesian analysis. We can think of our initial priors as placeholders, and we can run the model and let those results guide which components need better priors and iterate as needed. And so, for instance, if we run our model, if we have posterior density and unreasonable regions of interpretable parameters, that's an obvious place to add add priors. I'll get into some ideas on how to do this in the next handful of slides. We also might have bizarre posterior geometries and nuisance parameters. This is really common, especially in selectivity, double logistic and double normal selectivity curves, where things can go really wrong. But we don't really want those to kind of derail a whole analysis. Another one is HMC or Nuts divergences, which are concentrated in subsets of the posterior. The canonical example in the literature is like a funnel, hypervariance funnel. But I've seen this in stock assessments too, where you kind of just get really sharp corners amongst, two or more parameters, and the algorithm is trying to draw samples from that, kind of can't get into that corner, and that's, it'll throw divergences there. So those, we can kind of use those as just really baseline tools to identify, which components of the models are misbehaving or pathological or having issues. It's kind of the language that's often used. And if you flip it around, it's like, you run your model and your catchability coefficient is very well defined by the data, samples really well, has a high effective sample size and a low R hat. Why would we go out and do process research to get a prior for that, when that's going to be really expensive? So it's a bit of a change in how we think about Bayesian model, and I understand that, and I think that's why there's been a lot of studies on it, and there's a lot of discussion about it. So keep an open mind, and I'm curious to hear what people think as we move forward. So yeah, I guess the last comment on this slide is something I've made in a previous paper where, when we do have these pathologies or weird geometries, I think it's good to know about those. It gives us really important insight into the statistical properties of our model, essentially the geometry of the posterior and how the data and priors are impacting that, and whether and it's up to you to kind of investigate that and see if it's important for your model. But I would say, if you have a bimodal posterior, do you want to know about it? Probably. And so those kinds of things, parameters and bounds, crazy correlations, I think it's valuable to learn those things about your model. It helps you think through, what it's doing in some of the subcomponents of it, which is something that we do think about. I think we do a good job as a field, but it just gives us a much richer, a richer impression, a richer insight into what our model's actually doing, and I think that's a good thing. So next, I'm going to talk about a couple different tools that we can use to specify priors. Jim and others have been, the last 5 or so years have been doing some really cool stuff on life history variance correlations. Jim has this package called FishLife, which fits some crazy models to a bunch of different data. I'm not a biologist, I don't really understand the taxonomy that's going on here, but the idea is that you can install this R package and put in a scientific name and a different level of the taxonomy, and you can get a prior out. And these priors are correlated, so K and M, or I just pulled one example from the paper here, but W infinity and L infinity, and those change. And so I would propose that these can make good default or placeholder priors for many of our models. We should definitely talk about this, and there's some caveats to doing it, but there's a lot of good information there, and I think especially in parameters we care about and parameters we know are correlated, and so we want our prior to reflect that, as as they put it, multivariate predictions as a joint prior distribution would restrict parameter estimates of plausible life history strategies. That's one way to think about the prior, is it should restrict the posterior to plausible values, right? So there's certain combinations of K and M which could arise from marginal priors that just don't make sense based on biology and life history. And so we would like the prior, I think, to help constrain those. Yeah. So I think that's something as a field we should think a lot more about and experiment with. The second tool I want to talk about today is what's called prior predictive checks. And these are used to understand implications of priors in a generative model. So again, our assessments are basically already generative models. So it's an issue, just to keep in mind. And there's a couple advantages. It allows us to look at the interplay between the prior distribution on the parameters and the likelihood. I'll go into this a little bit more. And another kind of interesting thing is it can be used to elicit expert prior knowledge on measurable outputs. So like, I'll show an example of this later, but it's hard to know what the priors for selectivity parameters should be, but I think a lot of people can look at a particular selectivity curve and say, that doesn't make sense. And so when you put a quantity on, when you convert a quantity into something that's, observable or more understandable, it allows people to provide their expertise. And I'll walk through an example of this in just a second. Another kind of important point is that we do this without using the data, which is in contrast to posterior predictive, which this is a good thing. So this is kind of pulled from Michael Betancourt's principled Bayesian workflow. And here's how he proposes we think about it. It's very mathematical. He's a very mathematical person, but let me walk through this. So he says we should define a summary function T, which projects the entire product space, Y, the data, and theta, the parameters, into some interpretable lower dimensional space. So in that case that I just gave, selectivity parameters would be theta, and what we would project down to is, say, the selectivity at age 5, right? So that's a lower dimensional projection of what he calls the product space, or what's the joint distribution of the data and the parameters, the generative process. So now that we have T, which has some interpretation, we can start to reason through what are extreme values. So a priori, not looking at the data, not thinking about the data, we want to define thresholds that separate reasonable from extreme, but possible values of that summary function. So I'm looking at here, this is just conceptual, it's clearly a normal distribution, but some conceptual distribution of T. And basically what we're saying is, anything outside of these tails, we would consider extreme. That's our expert opinion. But notice we're not bounding, we're saying, yeah, there's a normal distribution. So maybe, 1 or 2% of the probability mass is outside of those tails. So if the data really strongly suggests T is over here, then it can pull it over. So we're not eliminating that as a possible value. We're just essentially constraining it and saying that that's extreme and it needs a lot of information in the data in order to fight against that. So in practice, he's got a lot of math talking about this, but
I have a question.
Yes.
Okay. Kiva asks, one thing that has always made me anxious about prior predictive checks is that in practice, it is next to impossible to think about reasonable values without looking at the data that is included in the model. How have you been able to keep these two phases distinct?
Yeah, it's an awesome question. And I think particularly hard for us because we're talking about doing stock assessments that, some of us have done before, maybe done for 20 years. And so we're intimately familiar with the biology and the data already. And I think that's a really big challenge. But I think that the short answer is that you know, we can be transparent and clear about how we came up with those thresholds, and try to base them off of kind of first principles or physical limitations, and then just be clear about how we set those. But she's absolutely right that there's a little bit of mental gymnastics to not just set your priors based on what you know about the stock you're intimately familiar with. And that's certainly not what we're proposed doing. And Michael's very clear about this in the case study. You know, ideally you'd have your data in a sealed envelope, and then you do this, and then you'd open your data. We don't really have that luxury, but I think that we can still use it, as long as we're pretty transparent about it. Then I think that's the best we're going to do. We also can base it, like I said, base it on physical attributes. So you might, yeah. I'll get to a couple of examples in a second, but it sounds like you had a follow-up, Emily.
I have, Rick Mathot mentioned an example could be a prediction of reasonable selectivity. And then Jim asks, would you need to compute a broad diversity of that T, Y thetas?
Agree, Rick. I'm going to do that in a second. I'm not sure I understand Jim's question. Can you repeat it?
Sure. Jim asks, would you need to compute a broad diversity of the x-axis, basically, in that figure?
Yes, exactly. And that's what we're going to do. So let me just back up. So this is kind of a conceptual model. We don't know what the analytical distribution of T is, and so we need a way to. So we can't check. It's difficult analytically to check whether our priors imply this distribution on T, on our summary function. And so that's what prior predictive checks are. Is we're going to use simulation to do that. So I think this will answer Jim's question. So what we do is we simulate from our priors. We define a prior model, right? We have priors. We have a joint model of parameters and data. We're specifying priors for parameters, and we're just simulating from those. We evaluate the model, and then we can additionally simulate data to approximate the summary function PDF. So that's the idea. Is we take we start with a placeholder prior model. This is a joint prior model. We simulate from all of them, and we compute a distribution of T. Simulate 10,000 draws from the joint prior, and you get 10,000 values for T. You can plot a histogram. And the idea is that we want our histogram to kind of fall in those range, right? So if you have a 10,000 draws, you would just want, maybe a few hundred to be outside of your thresholds. Do I have that in the next slide? I'm sorry, I should have so you can imagine, I should have put this instead actually, but you can imagine if this T distribution, the histogram in red, was really dispersed, right? So those thresholds were like really close to the mode. That would then tell us that our priors are too wide. They're too diffuse. Or as Michael puts it, if the output is at odds with our domain expertise here is those thresholds, those definition of those thresholds, what's extreme and what's reasonable, then we have to refine our prior model until the prior push forward check is better behaved. So that's the iterative process here is we plot this histogram and we evaluate whether our thresholds are approximately met, and if they're not, we need to adjust our priors. So it's a way of tuning the priors based on some output that has some interpretable meaning, and a meaning that you feel comfortable saying has a reasonable range and an extreme range of values. And again, there's no data use in this process. Did that answer your question, Jim? Yep. I can hear you in the next room. Okay, good. Um, um, okay, so let's talk a little bit about, let's dive a little bit deeper into this. There's some language I think bears clarifying in literature. A lot of times these are just referred to as prior predictive checks, as in that Michael splits that into two different concepts. Um, Prior push forward check considers that summary function, that t, that depend only on the model configuration space. So this, in other words, um, there's no data, there's no observation model involved. So that would be true, for instance, with selectivity, right? If this t was like selectivity at age 5, there's no data simulation involved there. So we would call that a prior push forward check. Alternatively, if it depends on the observational space, we'd call it prior predictive. And this is in line with our kind of analogous to posterior predictive check, which we'll talk about in later in this. Let's just do a time check. Okay, no, we're not going fast enough. Okay, I ordered this in terms of what I think is most important. So if we like run out of time, I'll skip stuff at the end. Okay. So how do we use these in our integrated stock assessments? Let's look at a couple examples. I guess I would note prior predictive is less useful since our observation errors are fixed. So usually we say, think about an index, we have a specified CV that we input. We're not estimating the observation error within the model. If we were estimating the observation error, this T here could be observed, say, relative or absolute biomass survey, for instance. And that observation error, you'd have a prior on that observation error, say the CV or the standard error. And that would have a lot of influence on the distribution of P here, right? But we don't really typically have that. And so I think in general, what's most useful are prior push forward checks. So let's look at one. Let's see if I can convince the audience that this is a reasonable thing to do. So say I'm building a stock assessment and I have a random walk process on logit of Q. So for some reason I've asserted that Q is between 0 and 1. And I want to assert that absolute value annual changes are less than 0.3. By that I mean, catchability in the next year should not be more than 0.3 different. It shouldn't go from 1 to 0.2, for instance, from one year to the next. Which I think sounds pretty reasonable. So in the Pollock model I work on, Martin, the creator of it, has a random walk like this essentially, and it's due to spatial availability. And the argument was that it really shouldn't move that much from year to year. And so I think based on what we know of kind of the biology of the stock, that seems reasonable. Okay, so yeah, that's our assertion. So here I have on the X, I have year here, and this is Q. These are just, each line is a draw from the prior. I'm not doing this in the assessment, I'm doing this external, just a little R script to do this. And then I set some basically broad priors on the random walk variance, and then just plot the trajectories of Q and the histogram of annual differences. And you can see that there are some cases where it goes from 0 to 1 or 1 to 0 within a year. And so our assertion is that that's implausible. So I just tuned the prior, I tuned that variance, I constricted it, put a tighter prior on it. I think I put a gamma, I put in a kind of informative gamma prior on it, repeated the experiment, and we can see what I would consider to be much more reasonable trajectories on catchability. And they kind of satisfy that assertion that we've made. So this is a bit of a made up example, but I thought it was kind of fairly clear, the whole point of doing it. Let's think about doing it for selectivity as well. So this is another.
I have a quick question from Rick again. Rick, I'm going to unmute you just because I'm not sure what the DM is.
There you go. Cole, I was asking, you said this part of this doesn't work if we're estimating observation errors, but are we not effectively estimating observation errors when we're doing something like Dirichlet multinomial?
Yeah, actually, absolutely. Yeah, I didn't say we never do. I say we typically don't, and that would be a case where we do, and then
Okay.
then we would want to do a prior predictive check. This is going to be tricky, but the idea is you'd actually simulate from Dirichlet multinomial, just and have a distribution of potential or hypothetically observed data, and that's what you would then condition your understanding on, and that would include the process, the structure of the model, the expected values of selectivity, but it also include that theta parameter. I always forget what it means, but if your theta is too big, it's going to be over dispersed or vice versa, and so that could theoretically help you set a prior on theta by looking at not at the predictions, but looking at simulated data. So yeah, that's a good point. And I'm sure there's other instances where we do estimate observation error. And so I'm not claiming that doesn't happen, but for the kind of standard inputs, typically effective sample sizes are fixed for comps and for indices. Thanks, Rick. Unless you have a follow-up, I'll plow on here. So let's think about selectivity. This is a double logistic selectivity. I did this so long ago, I don't remember where I got it, but it's probably from synthesis. I'm a little nervous now that Rick's on the call because I kind of forget the details, but just as an illustration, right? So we have 3 parameters. Well, I'll just think about age selectivity, ages 1 to 15 or something. And let's assert that selectivity at age 1 is close to 0, selectivity at age 5 is close to 1, and selectivity at age 15 is probably less than selectivity at age 5. And this comes back to Kiva's question of like, how can we know this a priori? I suppose one thing you could do is you could, look at other stocks of similar species. So like maybe, for pollock in the Gulf, I could look at pollock in the Bering Sea or those things. But it certainly is tricky to separate out. And I'm going to argue that even if we can't separate it out, we still need to regularize our selectivity curves for computational reasons, and we can come back to that. I put three parameters: uniform 0 to 10, and then the colors here are. So I push that through the selectivity module, and I pull out selectivity at 3 different ages. Age 1 is in black, age 2 is 5 is in red, and age 15 is in green. So I'm just plotting those, and you can see really immediately that there's really weird interactions, right? So as these parameters vary in that joint 3-dimensional space, they interact in very unpredictable ways. And this is true this is even worse for double normal. It's something we kind of have to deal with, but it's part of the reason why it's virtually impossible to specify kind of meaningful priors on the actual parameters. So instead, that's using these like really broad uniform priors, which don't really make any sense. This is just an illustration. This is the implied, the prior push forward distribution of that selectivity curve, and is pretty wild. It kind of has some really weird behavior. That's because some of these parameters, some of them are in log space and some of them aren't, and so and then there's a ton of nonlinearities including or also in the selectivity curve itself. And so it's just really tricky to think about how that behaves. But if you put in broad uniform priors, which is the default synthesis in most places, if you bound it, you get kind of these crazy shapes. These are just like credible intervals. So the idea being I can just start kind of playing with this, try thinking through what each parameter means and trying trying to kind of get something closer to this by tightening the priors on those 3 parameters, resimulating and repeating until I get something that I think is reasonable. You know, so I made a plot, but I don't think I have it here. You know, some of these activity curves, like it goes from like, you know, from, you know, 1 to, it's like knife edge up at 1 and flat the whole time. Some of them are like flat and then up knife edge at the very end. And you know, I think we can all agree that some of those combinations, some of those selectivity curves, implied push forward selectivity curves, should be eliminated by the prior model. I hope that's not controversial. Happy to discuss it if it is. I'll push forward here. So that, you know, I did a example of catchability, an example of selectivity. Like, what happens if we actually do it on the whole model, right? I pulled out, you know, I did those separately. So this is using a synthesis model again. This is a flathead sole, Bering Sea flathead sole model that I did for a year or so. Doesn't really matter. The idea is that I can go into the control file and I can look. MG parm2 is bounded from 2 to 30, and so if I want to draw a prior from it, that's uniform, right? Random uniform, 1 random uniform value between 2 and 30. Just go through and repeat that for every single parameter in your model. I know of no easy way to automate that, by the way. But it, you know, takes a few minutes. Then I have a function, so I can call, here it is, right? I can just call this function 2,000 times. I get a matrix of priors, 1 for each, you know, like a row for each draw, columns being the parameters. I have a function in my R package to write the PSV, so I just point it at the right folder and the model name. And then you can run MC_eval, and ADMB will read that in, thinking that it's it's a posterior file that it wrote itself. These are in bounded space, by the way, and populate all of your outputs. And then you can pull it into R. If this is synthesis, you can pull it into R and do all that other stuff. Of course, you could do this with the bespoke model as well. This write PSV will work for any ADMB model. So let's look at what it does. So here is spawning stock biomass in the y-axis, and that's in log scale. So we're going from e to the -7 to e to the 8. So way too many orders of magnitude. But really what's happening is, if we look at the B ratio, we can see that a ton of these, the vast majority of these draws lead to a collapse fishery, right? The B ratio, sorry, this is it's depletion. So depletion goes to 0. Excuse me. Yeah, and this, I'm going to pivot a little bit, so maybe this is a good chance to ask for discussion or ask questions. I think it's a little less useful, especially for synthesis models, to do it on the whole model, because a lot of the outputs aren't available. The prior push forward or wouldn't be available. Maybe that's not true in new versions, but it's a little clunky to work with in any case. So I think doing it by module can be helpful. And if you have a bespoke model, obviously you can just code this up yourself. So
I have a question.
Yes.
I have a question from Ian. He says, what's happening in the 1998 or 1988, 1989 in the prior predictive check time series? I think he's talking about the B ratio one.
Yeah, absolutely. This jumps out. I don't know. And I think that demonstrates the value of this. I wish Maya were online. I think she's busy, but she did this talk most recently. I don't remember well enough. But I think that's the idea, right? It's kind of a different look at what your model's doing. So that's certainly something I would want to investigate. So this kind of issue of you know before you have any data, all of your predictions are a collapsed stock is it's not a new thing. This has been known for decades now. I don't know if Andre's online, but he in talks he always kind of grumpily shouts the Borel paradox, and nobody knows what he means, and he never really clarifies it. But that's what that was passed around the literature a while ago, and there's some really fancy solutions like Bayesian melding, and it's kind of a whole thing. I don't want to get into it too much now. It's an important topic, but I don't want to address it now. In kind of a similar vein, so part of this is driven by the scale of R0. So the population is going to crash if we start with too few fish. Yeah, we're just gonna catch them all. And so the implication here is that there's too much. Well, the prior on ln RZO is a bit off. So Jim and Jason have a really cool paper from 2017 where they talk about this for the context of data limited stocks. This is it's a little more complicated, but you can kind of think of this as similar to a likely profile. The idea being that there's a long upper tail where the data can't differentiate between a stock that's like giant and like essentially never been fished, and anything higher than that, it's just flat because the data have no effect anymore. And so the point they make in their paper is that when you set your upper bound on ln of R0, for a frequentist model that doesn't really have an effect, but for a Bayesian model, because you're integrating over the whole thing, that becomes a really long tail, and you get very different answers, management answers. It's a totally valid point. It's a good point. It's a really interesting paper. And I guess I would just thinking about priors for the scale of things. 30 is unreasonable, and they even acknowledge that this would require an upper bound for the population scale that any rational person would find implausible. And so for me, that hints at these kind of prior predictive. We can use physical or other thresholds to set our priors. So let's get into this a second. But I would argue that most of our data-rich assessments, at least, are not sensitive to prior. And if it is, I guess the point of Jim and Jason's paper is that that's a fault or a problem with doing Bayesian analysis for these stocks. I actually think it's a good thing. I think if our stock is highly sensitive to the prior we put on R0, we want to know about that, I think. And if you ran if you did maximum likelihood on this, you would get an answer, and you'd get a confidence interval for ln R0 that is not infinite, when kind of in a sense it would kind of obscure that issue. And I guess I'm not totally comfortable with that being better. But kind of interesting to think about. So should we use vaguely informative priors on R0? I think we probably should consider it. I think we could all agree that there's probably fewer recruits than atoms in Earth. So there's a physical threshold that we could assert. It's also probably not the largest stock in the world. So, Barron C. Pollock is, age 1 recruits or something like here, so 30, is 30 as an upper bound really plausible? I don't think so. I think we could probably agree that 30 is too high, and even in the paper they say certainly anything less than 20 for West Coast groundfish assessments is as an upper bound. So like I feel like it's kind of been stated that like we have absolutely no idea what the scale of the stock is. It's like, well, I think we do. I think we could reason through some, and I think as a field that would be worth thinking about doing. But I think bottom line, when you do Bayesian inference, this effect will be apparent. If there's a long upper tail on RZO, that will be very apparent, and that should be explored and communicated clearly when it does. And this is obviously going to be much more common for data limited situations, and also depending on the fishing history. So that brings us to, I just thought I'd open it up. Does anybody vehemently disagree with any of this? Does anybody love the idea, or have they done this kind of thing before, and how did it work? I'd love to just stop talking for a second and see what people think. Please ask questions. Oh, I can see something in the chat. Probably when the survey data started. Yeah, something like that. Except there's no survey data, so no.
I have a question from Jim. Jim, you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Sorry, just wanted to, is this a time, you went through the prior data generation or prior, I guess, parameter generation pretty quickly. Is that your recommended way of doing it, or is it better to design software so that you can turn off data and sample from the prior directly? Just
yeah, I think yeah, I think sampling from the prior, if there's some automated way to do that, which seems feasible, you just have a flag to turn off the likelihood component, could potentially be a much simpler thing to do. I don't, I was using synthesis as an example here, so I just did it in R. But yeah, I think making it accessible and automated would be a really good thing, and I actually make that point at the end. So thanks, Jim.
I also have a comment from Rick. He says he's loving it. Prior predictive checks are mostly implemented in stock synthesis. Stock synthesis 3 already.
Okay, great. Yeah, sorry, I've kind of lost track a little bit of the new developments in synthesis. So thanks. Yeah, so I mean, there's definitely some lingering issues, but I think, as I see it, we kind of, as a field, I think we should start thinking about and discussing and arguing about almost the philosophy of it, of, can we use these tools? Is that philosophically okay to do if we've already seen the data? All these are, I think, really important questions. And I think tough questions, but I just come back to this point. Like, I don't think we can just, I don't think it's valid to just walk away from a Bayesian analysis because you don't know how to set the prior on the third parameter of your double normal selectivity for, fishery 3.
Cole,
Okay.
I have a question.
Please.
You said, or you mentioned earlier in the talk that there's been a few fields that have done kind of a deeper dive into this Bayesian framework for their own fields. Like I'm thinking like disease modeling probably also has a similar problem where they've, like experts have seen the data before. Did they have any thoughts on how to best kind of separate the processes?
That's a really good question. I don't know off the top of my head. I've skimmed those papers. They're not my field. I think part of the problem is that their models are much more interpretable, and don't have these problems like with, if we go back to this, their models don't look like this. They're much better behaved. And so I think in general, it's easier to do these like prior predictive push forward. I don't specifically remember them discussing, kind of that double counting of the data, like seeing the data before. But that's a really good point, and something that we could go back and look at those papers and look and see how they dealt with that. Because you're right. I mean, they're going to have the same problem. So yeah, that's a great idea. Thanks. I'm just gonna assume that silence is means that you agree with me, so that's great.
Yeah, and then if everyone or anyone has any more questions, you can raise your hand and I can unmute you, or you can put them in the questions box or the chat box. I'm watching all of them.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so let's plow forward. So kind of covered the basics of priors and how we can think about priors. And you know, maybe I didn't say this and I should have. You know, what the goal of doing that is that, let me actually go back to this. The goal of doing that is that doing that kind of prior tuning is that our prior model doesn't conflict with our understanding of the world. And you know, that's a lot easier to deal with if you're doing, you know, regressions and, you know, simpler models, or everything has like interpretable output. But I think that's something that we should strive for as a field, is that our prior model, you know, our prior push forward model reflects our expertise of what's going on. And it's fine to say we don't know, right? Like that's a fine thing to do as well, but it's something to strive for. And I think something we should try to focus on more. Okay, let's move now to posterior predictive checking. So this is the analog of prior predictive checking. So we're checking the observation model itself. And after we've, you know, shown the model the data. So this is used to check for model misfit. Do note it can be overly optimistic. Unlike the prior predictive checking, it uses the data twice for fitting and for checking. So that's something to look out for. And typically we just look at, the field just looks at graphical summaries of data or statistics. I found this in one of the papers, I think the Gelman paper, it talks about a severe test. You know, these are ones that are likely to fail if the model would give misleading answers to the questions we care the most about. And for me, that's like a really pivotal thought and idea that we should flush out of, you know, what does it look like when our models break, and how do we come up with a statistic that would capture that. I think it's really interesting and something I definitely haven't fully worked out. But just like the prior predictive, same idea, right? We have posterior samples. We just push those through and simulate data. That gives us a distribution of simulated data conditioned on the observed data and the model. Yeah, I already said that. So in ADMB, it's probably easiest to use R in most cases. You know, you just pull out expected values, do a R log normal or R multinom or whatever. DMB is a little bit more sophisticated and has, you know, simulate macros. So model I'm most familiar with is WHAM, and Tim and Brian have done a really good job of always having simulate statements in all their likelihood code. So I think certainly for TMB based models, that simulate macros are definitely the way to go. Just have everything done in C++, have it integrated in. But it's easy to do in ADMB too. It's pretty trivial. And then the idea here is that the observed data should look like the simulated data if the model is fitting correctly. I will note, you know, you could calculate, you know, you have a distribution of simulated data, you have an observed data, you can and I will calculate predictive p-values, just kind of where it is in the distribution. But we have to be really careful about interpreting that, because they, under the null hypothesis, will not have uniform distributions, which is easy to assume they would. And there's some kind of tricky reasons why they don't, which I don't fully understand, to be honest. So let's not overinterpret p-values is the point. So for indices, it's pretty straightforward. This is, I just picked a couple, this is from assessment I do now. There's a couple surveys. These are indices, the red points of the observed data, the lines of the simulated data. I think more interesting is looking at the comps. You know, these indices things have been done a lot already. I think more interesting is the comps. So, you know, we can do bubble plots. So these are posterior predictive bubble plots by calculating a p-value and then doing like a stable normal transformation, you know, to go from 0, 1 to standard normal quantile. And so that's what those are. So the size is kind of related to how far in the tails it is, the observed is relative to the simulated, and then the color is which side it's on, basically. And so I don't know if anybody's ever done that or if that's a good idea, and I think it would be another great thing to discuss. I'll put it here side by side with Pearson residuals on the left. We can see some similar patterns, but also not that similar. So I don't know what to think about that, whether we should trust the Pearson residuals or these. So I think there needs to be some work done on how to interpret these, or if we even should use them. But we don't have to just look at bubble plots, right? Like, you know, one of the points is that we can look at any statistic, any, you know, by statistic I mean like any quantity calculated from model output, or sorry, from data. So, you know, maybe we want to pool across years. This is, I should step back. This is like this is fishery selectivity, or sorry, this is fishery catch it age with time varying selectivity, time varying double logistic. The ascending slope and inflection point are both time varying, so it's pretty flexible selectivity, especially in the younger ages. Anyway, so let's pool across years and look at the distribution, the percent fish. So essentially pooling across all years to see, can I, over the whole time span, am I getting age 6 right? So each column here is a different age. I'm only showing ages 6 to 10 just to clarify things. And then the rows are different data sources. These are different age compositions sources. So fishery, and then there's a couple surveys. So focusing on fishery, we can see that it's like not doing a very good job for these older ages. Whereas for the surveys, it's doing well, right? That red line falls within that simulated distribution of you know, percent fish by age. You know, and I think there's a lot of, you know, there's a lot of different, well, that's my next slide, sorry. I hear myself, so somebody's unmuted. No? Okay. So yeah, let's have a discussion. I think, you know, I would argue we should develop a standard set of outputs that can be used consistently and are easily interpretable, right? So everyone kind of gets used to looking at the same thing. They're severe in the sense that they're gonna quickly flag when we have model misfit, and then just kind of make that into best practices. What are some key statistics we should explore? I don't know. I mean, I think we should test things and explore them and fit them, you know, look at them on simulated data and see how they behave. But like, for instance, we could for the comps, we could, you know, we could look at variance and simulate data sets and compare it to the variance for the observed, and let's see if we can detect under or over dispersion. That to me seems like a fairly reasonable thing to do. It could kind of signal, you know, whether the observation model is correct. Maybe it's, you want to move from a multinomial to a Dirichlet multinomial. You know, that by looking at the variance, which is a statistic of the data, right? It's a property of the data in the simulated data. You know, I think we could, it kind of makes sense to me to explore things like that. And I think there's a lot of different things that we could check. And I'm kind of new to stock assessment, so, and have limited experience. So I think opening that up, and, you know, I'm sure the tuna models would have very different answers to that. But I think as a field, it would be good to think that through more.
Oh, I have a question from Jim. Jim, you can unmute.
Yeah, thanks. If you could go back one slide again, just on this one, the red line is the original data or the prediction. And where would you put the prediction for the LE or the?
The histogram is simulated data. So this is posterior predictive. So for each posterior sample, I have an expected value for fishery age comp in all years. and I just take a draw based on the effective sample size that's used in the model, and that gives me simulated replicate. And then I in this case I'm just calculating what's the percent of fish for an age across the whole data set. And then the red line is that same calculation done for the observed data. And so that misfit suggests that the selectivity curve is not fully capturing the dynamics of the selectivity.
It seems like this would follow on from the bubble plot, just because you had all those red posterior draws on the right-hand side here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so I guess for me the mystery is like why those are red and these are more versus rows a little more spaced out. And I haven't looked into that, but that's the whole point, right? Is that we're not limited to just in frequentist aspect here. It's a little more limited to calculating residual, and this we can do. We can come up with all sorts of creative and informative statistics to look at, and I think that will be key to making these checks more useful.
I have a question from Christine. Is some misfit unavoidable if you have conflicts in the data? For example, if the fishery has bias, but we trust the survey more, do you think you can model your way out of that, or at some point do you just remove data?
Oh yeah, I mean that's a bigger question. Is what to do. I guess I would refer Christine to the CAPM best practices, and I think getting selectivity fishery right is important for getting the removals right. So I don't think just kind of ignoring it is a good idea. I'm not saying that my selectivity is bad here. I'm just saying it looks worse than the surveys, and I think it behooves me to look at that deeper over the next year. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a bigger, a broader, important question of what do you do when there's misfit, and I think it's the same as with frequentist models. I don't think there's a philosophical or conceptual difference in how we react to model misfit. Okay.
I have one more question from Jim.
Sorry for being the one, and just to complete that, on that last slide, if you could go back again, that is kind of analogous to R4SS figures where they collapse across all the years and just show the model fit, but this is obviously by age. Just to complete that, and I actually really like this because sometimes you'll get a lack of fit in the aggregate, which in my mind should always fit really well. That you can get a lack of fit that's not so noticeable. I think this is a great way of showing it.
Yeah, correct. It's like the RFSS, like pooled ones. Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's the question we have to say is like, what do we want our models to do, and what statistics and what tests can we do to ensure that they're doing that. And I don't have the answer to that. I'm just putting it out there that that's something that would be valuable for us as a field to start to hash out. Yeah, I welcome any feedback on that. Thanks, Jim. Okay, I'm going to pivot topics here. I feel like we've maybe hit the last. So process error estimation, we're going to get time. Okay, we might need to skip some of the sections. That's okay. Sorry, I didn't practice and time this, so it's going a little long. But don't worry, I'll skip as needed. So process error estimation. So TMB now has the applause approximation, so it's trivial to estimate hypervariances or process errors using maximum marginal likelihood. ADMB does have this option, but it's limited and it's not really used in stock assessments, which is why we fix our process errors at values and pretend like that's a good idea. So I guess what I want to show is that, you know, in ADMB, we can estimate those with MCMC. So, you know, TMB, the loss approximation is a way to approximate an integral. I guess uses an integral to approximate the marginal likelihood. You know, in nuts, MCMC in general is integration. It's integrating the whole posterior. So that means we can estimate hypervariances. In fact, that's one of the reasons why Bayesian methods became so popular in the 80s and 90s. Is all of a sudden with bugs you could fit hierarchical models really quickly. Anyway, let's try it. So this is the Pollock model I've kind of been showing. It has I turned on estimation of 3 process errors. 2 of them are capability, and 1 of them is recruitment, sigma R. So let's just turn it on and see. So these are like the default settings using nuts. So hopefully this output is starting to be familiar. So it ran for, you know, over 3.5 hours, and I got 4 samples. I got 4 effective samples out of it. So low absolute samples, very low relative, and an atrocious R hat. So basically, it didn't fit at all. It's a total failure. And why? So if I look at the R hat and ESS for the variances, it's actually pretty good. These are the slowest 3 mixing parameters. I'll just let me just kind of walk through what this means. So on the diagonal here, we have the traces of the 5 chains. And then the off diagonal is it's a pairs plot. So it's just showing the posterior samples in a pairs plot. So I've ordered these. These are the 3 slowest mixing, the lowest effective sample size. And so you can see here's 4, 4, 4. So these are just not mixing at all. And the problem is that there's a really huge, strong correlation here, and that propagates through for all bunch of Deves, resulting in a pretty gnarly correlated surface. So if we can account for those correlations, it should be better. So the way to do that in the nuts world and you know the STAN world is to use what's called a dense mass matrix. I don't want to talk about this stuff because I've given seminars about it. I just want to show how we can do this. So the problem is we get correlations for those 3 sigma parameters. We'd have to optimize the model. That doesn't work. You can try, but it won't work usually. It'll either crash or give you crazy values. So there's just a trick. So I can pull the unbounded, I can basically pull the matrix, unbounded covariance matrix. You can think of that as the correlation matrix from the ADMB output. And then I can just splice in, basically think about like adding a couple 3 rows and columns to that correlation matrix and just putting in zeros on the off diagonals, so no correlation, but putting marginal variances in. In this case, I'm doing 0.2 squared. And so the idea here is that all the correlations of the other parameters, the fixed effects, are going to be captured in the correlation, but it will also have the sigmas in there. So a little bit of just kind of trickery. And then when I call it from R, I'm going to, you know, highlight it in this red box. I'm going to it's a new thing. So metric is cove.new. So that's the matrix, the covariance matrix in unbounded space that I created right there. Adaptive mass dense is true. That's going to use that matrix as an initial value for the for that metric, the mass matrix that is, but tune it, right? So as it warms up, it's going to tune it. But it's typically very hard to tune those mass matrices. So what we need is a long adapt window, which is basically how many iterations to wait until you try to update the mass matrix. So pretty technical, but I just want to point out if I run that, you know, same model, but 17 minutes, and I have a min ESS of 788, you know, 15%, and a very small R hat, so, and 0 divergences. So that converged in less than 20 minutes. I have, you know, basically full integration, including estimation of 3. Here's what it looks like. I ported this model over to a TMB version, and so I have frequentist estimates of the MLE. These 2 on the right are the catchability these are process errors, right? So very hyper standard deviations, I guess. The red line is the MLE, asymptotic MLE. The black line is the prior that I put on, and then the histogram is the posterior. So you can see for the two process errors for catchability, it matches almost identically, which is nice to see. It's pretty different for recruitment, and I'm not sure why. I don't want to read too much into it because the ported model is a little bit different, but it both suggest very large recruitment errors, sigma R's. But just really a demonstration that, yeah, if you really want to estimate process errors, do like true hierarchical stock assessments, you can do it. Takes a little bit of trickery, and but tends to work well. We have the tools to do it now. You just need to play with it, basically. And that is to say, adaptive dense mass matrix is key. And if you look at the vignette for 80 nuts, I talk about how that works a little bit and what it means if you're not familiar with that. Okay, blowing through that. So moving on to computational problems. Most, I would argue most of our models are over-parameterized in some way, particularly our selectivity curves. So really, this process is kind of backwards from normal, where we start with a simple model and we add complexity and add a new data and kind of build up a model. Really, what we're doing is we're starting down here with these complex models that maybe can't be fit or that give nonsensical results, and we're kind of simplifying back to these ones that can fit. And Gelman et al. Argue, have this is a quote. That dotted line represents the idea that by problems I mean kind of computational issues, struggling to fit or taking forever to fit, those kinds of things, can be identified somewhere between these two models. So that's part of the workflow, right? Is we're going to build a series of generative models and estimate them all and watch how it behaves as we add that complexity and potentially as we add different and new data sets. And that's kind of an interesting way to think about it. So I put it on there. I've talked about this in a previous paper, so I don't go into it, but highlighted some causes. This can happen in particular for stock assessments. In the bottom line, especially with selectivity, better and stronger priors are needed. Gelman makes a point, as model complexity increases, our priors need to be stronger. It makes a really compelling argument. Demonstrates this really well with a simple regression, actually, and just adding covariance. If you keep the priors on those regression terms the same, you get very different prior push forward distributions, which is pretty interesting. I think in the context of stock assessments, I think of this more as structural complexity. If you've added 3 or 4 time varying processes, or like linked it to an environmental covariate, or gone from logistic to double normal or something, it's just we need more constraint from the priors to tame those models. That's not my point. This is a point that Gelman makes. But on the flip side, I think it's also really important to say, like, we can't just randomly and arbitrarily tweak our model until it runs fast. That's, quote, dangerous and can threaten the validity of inferences without there being a good way to diagnose the problem. And so the point is not that you just add priors until your model runs fast. It's that you run your model, you see what kind of computational problems you have, and then you look at the structure of the model and you investigate that and you figure out why it's doing that, and then try to pivot to resolve that or not. So that's part of the how you deal with computational problems in the context of this generative. Another kind of fun quote is, which I like, our first instinct when faced with a problematic model should not be to throw more computational resources, i.e. more iterations or more thinning, but to check whether a model contains some substantive pathology, which is usually the case. it's very, in my experience, it's very rare for a fully complicated synthesis model to need more than an hour or two. Definitely less than an hour if you don't have like conditional agent length or some other, tons of bins or something. You know, on the scale of things, a model with 300 or 1,000 or more parameters is trivial for the know your term sampler. It works on hundreds of thousands of parameters. The problem is if it's parameterized correctly, and it's a combination of parameterized correctly and how slow it is to calculate the gradients. And so that latter one is kind of out of our control. Like conditional agent length data is going to increase that a lot. The second quote I have is from an email string from a former SAPS director who was emailing me. People just were always email me like, hey, I can't get the model to work. And they said, it has forced me to think about things a bit more. In a moment of panic, blah, 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 I was worried I messed this thing up. So I checked my code and lo and behold, it does what it does. And I think that's great. I think that's the whole point, right? You run your model and you're like, hey, this correlation parameter of this whatever matrix is, this one correlation parameter is being really squirrely and it's just doing some really weird things. I need to go back and check my code, right? And I think, check to make sure that your math is correct, it's coded right, all that. That to me is like part of the point. You would never notice that if you weren't integrating your model with MCMC. So thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, so we're gonna switch over to cross-validation quickly. Emily, can I ask, I know it's booked for 2 hours, right?
Yes.
Do you want me to try to end like 2:45 or what?
I think that would be good just in case we have any more questions coming along.
Okay, we're gonna speed up, so buckle up. Cross-validation is a model selection technique. I would say, what we want to know is like if we had left out a data point, how well would our model have predicted that data point? That's basically the main point of it. It does give us a couple auxiliary pieces of information. It can help us identify difficult observations to predict and quantify how influential observations are. So John and Trevor, our own John, have a really cool paper last year, 2 years ago, where they kind of went pretty deep into this and really interesting, really cool figure here, really cool paper, just to highlight really, really good stuff. And I hope to see more studies like that. It's really helpful. Excuse me. Currently, what everybody's kind of a hot new thing is this PSIS LOL. I don't know how you're supposed to say that in your head, but it stands for Pareto Smooth Importance Sampling. Leave one out, cross-validation. So there's a mouthful either way. And so, Aki Vitari and others have a ton of papers on this, done a ton of theoretical and applied work, and make a strong case that WAIC is superior to DIC, and that PSIS LU is superior to WAIC. It's fully Bayesian. And probably the most important thing about it over WAIC is it provides important diagnostics called Pareto K values. And what that means is, so we're going to get a K value for each data point. And if it's over 0.7, it's considered high. If it's over 1, it's considered very high. And that when that does happen, it indicates model misspecification, outliers, or mistakes in data processing. So I ran this on this Pollock model. This has a bunch of different data sources, so I've kind of color-coded by like fishery, and then there's 6 surveys that go with it, and then the shapes of the different type of data, so comps, index, whatever. And so yeah, anything over 1 is like very bad. And in this case, what you would do is you would refit your model and take that data point out and calculate the exact predictive distribution, right? So we could and then merge that in. he has an example of how to do that, and it's automated in things like RSTAM, ARM. But what I want to focus on here is, there's discrepancies in high values among data sets. So, survey 2 and 3 and 4 and 6 all are doing well. Do not appear to have any sort of misspecification or undue influence. And really, our really high values are clustered in the fishery data, the catch, and a few in the age comps, and then index for survey 1, which is an acoustic survey. And if we had time, I would show you actual fits from the assessment, and these basically are not fitting well. There's a contradiction or a conflict in this data source and this one here. These two surveys are in conflict for a few years, and that pops those years out as being highly influential. So that's this Pareto smooth importance sampling Lou. It's pretty straightforward to run in R. The only tricky part is you have to modify your model to output individual components. But I think that kind of demonstrates the point that it's not just a number, like WAIC. You can get a Lou value too, the same, analogous to WAIC, but it also gives us another layer of information with these diagnostics. It's more information about our model, which I argue is quite valuable. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip this too. There's this really cool thing called simulation-based calibration. And what it does is it identifies inaccurate computations and inconsistencies in model implementations. That's the algorithm. This is how you could apply it to a known conjugate example. Basically, you're supposed to run this process and you get these uniform distributions out. I did this with SS's double normal selectivity curve, put pretty tight priors on it. This is the prior push forward distribution of that selectivity pattern. And then I did binomial sampling, so just kind of randomly values and drew points from those. So super informative data set. Should be able to fit this quite easily. So when I try this process, what happens is in this upper right here, this parameter 2, it's not uniform. And what that means is that the no U-turn sampler for the double normal selectivity is biased. And that's either a fundamental property of nuts or the selectivity curve, or I've made a coding error somewhere. I think that's unlikely because the other parameters are uniform. This is a figure from the paper where it's kind of showing, if you have a deviation from normal, what it means. And in this case, it means that you have some, right? You're supposed to, this distribution is supposed to fall on top of this one and it will be uniform, and it's not. And that implicates something causing bias, which I don't have an answer to, but we should dig in more. Maybe Rick can figure that out for me. Okay. Sorry to rush at the end. I'm actually not doing too bad here. So yeah, my overall recommendations, I just want to lay it out here. Let's think about how do we define best practices? This is my starting point, basically. I need help from the community, fleshing these out well. So here's what I say for developers. Obviously Bayesian workflows require different outputs than is typical. We need posteriors for all sorts of different things. And so I think from a developer standpoint, any new model, and especially generic next gen models, like I'm going to plug FIMS here, which is NOAA's new kind of in development next gen model. They should include native capabilities for prior and posterior predictive distributions and cross validation. And I also think we should strive to parameterize components to be integration friendly and have interpretable parameters. And I think both of those are important. Integration friendly meaning no weird corners or awkward. Don't bound a logged parameter, or, you know, there's like all these kind of weird things that can happen in assessments, you know, that make integration difficult. And we also want things to be, we want parameters to be approximately, you have unit variance, marginal unit variance, and have minimal correlation. So the idea is if we can parameterize our model to minimize those things, integration will just be a lot easier down the road. I think we can use simulation-based calibration to test model components to make sure that either they're coded correctly, the inference algorithms coded correctly, or if there's, and both of those are true, then there's some kind of fundamental issue in that, and we want to identify that before, you know, as early as possible. And simulation-based calibration provides a way to do that. Sorry, I had to rush through that. And I also think making comparisons between frequentist and Bayesian fits really easy is something that I think would be a valuable thing to build in from the start. Yeah, I've kind of, yeah.
Well, I have a quick question from Rick. Should prior predictive approach be used to improve the performance of non-parametric selectivity?
By performance, do you mean how it fits future data? Yes, is my answer. You know, you would want to tune your variance to a reasonable range so that you get selectivity curves that are not too wiggly, basically. Like you could assert, you know, from one length bin to the next or age to the next, it shouldn't change more than 0.2 or something.
Yeah, that's basically what I was thinking, that the variance you have on your prior will have a big influence on the degree of process error you estimate in the selectivity.
Yeah, exactly, and it should. I don't think we should put any prior mass on variances that predict absolutely nonsensical, non-parametric selectivity curves.
Yeah.
And this is just you know, we as a field, we get to assert and assume that and clarify that when we write it up. But this is just a tool to kind of guide that process. So yes, I think we should use it for as many components of our assessments as possible. I feel a little bad. I kind of didn't talk about TMB and TMB stand as much as I had hoped, but one key difference is that TMB stand is plugged in through RSTAN, and RSTAN currently does not expose the user the ability to pass a mass matrix to initialize. That is possible in command stand R, but not in RSTAN. I keep asking them if they're going to do it, and they keep thinking they will, but they haven't for quite a few years now. But that's going to be a problem for us if we keep building models with highly correlated parameters, like I showed when I estimated the process errors. You know, we need to either not have correlations, severe correlations, or we need to have dense mass matrix options. And so right now, TMB stand is kind of lacking in that department. But something hopefully we can get into RSTAN and then have available to TMB stand as well sooner rather than later. If somebody wants, they can, I don't know, they can help Casper. That would be great. Okay, so moving on. Yeah, please.
Cool. Ian, I guess related, says current modeling packages are often limited in their ability to accept correlated priors. Should we also be making this a high priority for development?
Oh, 100%. I love it. I should have put it. Absolutely. You know, like I gave the example of fish life. You know, it's not hard to, I mean, joint priors are not hard to evaluate. It's, you know, just on a, you know, multivariate normal in log space and evaluate it. That's not tricky. But yeah, I think the interface is the hard part, setting that up so that it's kind of as flexible and the user can specify different types of joint priors on different sets of parameters is definitely, in my opinion, going to be the hard part. But I will be very sad to not have that option in something like FIMS. You know, I think we should strive to do that early. Yes.
I have one more comment from Christine. She says, I do want to mention you may want LFO, leave future out, not leave one out, C.9 of the Baharti Q&A.
Yeah, absolutely. I had to skip it, but yeah, let's go back to cross validation. So, one of the questions that should be asked is, when is it valid? And Aki talks about this on his fact. I have the link down here if you're curious. Our data must be exchangeable, and we can have a model where that doesn't have conditional dependence, for instance, a time series. But if we condition on some latent state F, if those are exchangeable, then we can use them. Then it's valid to do cross validation. And I'll come back to Christine's point. This is linked to Christine's point. I was talking with Zoe a month or so ago, and she's way ahead of the stuff than me. But I guess I'm kind of conceptually, mathematically, or statistically struggling to understand, is F here a latent state? F is our population dynamic structure, right? Our age structure equations and all that. Does that count as a latent state? Are our data exchangeable? I honestly don't know. And this doesn't apply just to leave one out. It applies to AIC, and it applies to WAIC and DIC as well. I don't know the answer to this. I hope somebody in the audience does. But the point is that with cross-validation, what type of cross-validation you use, what data you leave out, that is, depend on what you're trying to do. So Christine's point is about leave future one out, and that's if you want to maximize your predictive ability on future data, then that's the way you want to do it. And there's some papers on it, and it's tricky, but I think we could set it up. If we do this leave one out cross-validation like I've shown here, that's leaving out observed data points without regard to any order. And basically what that's doing is just an overall kind of generic fit to the data. Can it predict a data point in any of the years given the rest of the data? And so I would say we would want to use that potentially for kind of like what John did in his paper, where it's like, well, I'm thinking about putting this environmental link in to M or something. You'd want to use cross-validation to test whether that seems to improve the overall model fit. And you could do it for leave one out, future one out as well. So the idea is we have to, Aki talks about this, you have to first define what prediction you care about, and then you have to make sure that your data are exchangeable. So point well taken that cross-validation is not so simple, and we should be ready to build in more sophisticated types. Does anybody think that this is true? This last question here, is this true? Any strong opinions or wild guesses? Take that as no? I don't know. I think this actually is probably the area that needs the most investigation. One of them, in my opinion. I don't know if we can trust cross-validation or how we should use it appropriately, especially when we're like doing Francis weighting on our comps and things like that. Like, how do we interpret those values that come out? It's tricky, I think. Okay, last slide. So thinking about from a user or analyst point of view, I think I encourage people, and I think we should generally recommend that people take time to investigate prior, push forward, and predictive checks. Like what are the implied priors in your model, and are those reasonable? And if they're not, think about changing them. I think that's good, even if you're doing a frequentist model. Explore sensitivity of key parameters. Compare priors to posteriors. That's pretty standard stuff. You can modify your bespoke models, use leave one out, and do posterior predictive checks. Synthesis is not able to do leave one out at the moment, but presumably can do posterior predictive checks. I don't want to see assessments where people just look at traces and say that it's converged. I propose this is our definition of converged. The minimum R hat is less than this, and the minimum max R hat is less than that, and the minimum ESS is greater than that. And I think everybody in there, if you're going to do this, you should report these values. And if they're either bigger or smaller than these, justify why you think that's okay. You know, this is for inference, not for exploration. I think that's it. Yeah, I have a bunch of references, and then yeah, thanks for your time and questions. And I'm gonna leave it maybe here or here and open it. I'll turn my camera on, and we can maybe of discussion. Put everybody to sleep.
I have lots of questions, but I don't want to be the only one talking.
Go for it, Jim.
Yeah.
You want to go ahead, Jim, first, and then Rick?
Sure, just on the, maybe it's a quick question, but you know that I don't want you to go back to the tricks to estimating the process error variances. But you know, looking back on some old Gelman publications, I thought one solution was for those cases to provide better prior, hyper prior, I guess, on the variance terms themselves. And you know, there's an example in one of the books I have that shows, yeah, this really works and it's defensible. But is that no longer good practice to, or was it ever a good practice to come up with just better priors on the variance terms?
Yeah, it's definitely good. Definitely good practice. I mean, we did that in the random walk Q example, right? We use prior push forward to tune that prior down, right? To constrain the process error using the prior, essentially shrinking the variance on the variance of the prior. You know what I mean? Yeah, I think what you're getting at is advice on priors for hyper variances has evolved over time. You know, for a while they were recommending like half Cauchy distributions. As far as I can tell, the latest recommendations kind of generically are to use half normal, or if you want to avoid the boundary or want to assert that there's definitely process error, then you can use a gamma, which will, you know, that's what I'm using here is gamma, which is you know, essentially keeping it from going to zero. And gamma makes a lot of sense to me because like I think it's pretty clear that we have process error in everything in our assessments, right? And so, you know, it kind of makes sense to me. In this case, obviously, you can tell by looking at a half normal would have, you know, also done the same thing. Sometimes people will put these gamma on here to try to get an MLE estimate of the variance. I tried that with a couple assessments and it never worked for me. ADB just kind of, the optimizer just like freaks out. Not surprisingly, but yeah. So I guess my answer is you pick either a half normal or a gamma, and you do prior push forward checks to help you tune what that should be.
Thanks.
I'm really sad we didn't get to walk through this simulation thing. Such a cool algorithm, but go read the paper. Any other questions? Rick, you were saying something?
No, I'm just musing about what you had been saying with cross-validation. It struck me to be comparable to what I see as a problem with our retrospective analyses and the biases that we see in retrospective analyses and age-structured models. Because once you start peeling data off the end, you're peeling off all the information about the recruitment deviations that have occurred. So the whole interaction between process error and retrospective bias is something that I don't understand myself on just how that should play out. But some of what we see as retrospective bias is simply because we have a draw of recruitments that are the recruitments at the end of a time series, and the simpler model can't possibly predict forward what the future deviations in recruitment would be. So of course they're going to be different. And I just think we are over-identifying retrospective bias because of that.
Interesting. Thanks. I guess kind of bigger picture is like, what is a stock assessment model? Is it is it truly a statistical model? Does it meet assumptions like this, or is it some kind of Frankenstein, hybrid statistical / biological thing that we can't overinterpret what it's doing, and I still have like not fully wrapped my head around like what.
Yeah. I sort of see it as a hybrid, and as a state space hybrid, right?
Mm-hmm.
A state space in concept. But yeah, I don't want to put too high a level of expectation on performance on statisticals, because as you say, the observations are not replaceable over time. They are relevant to that point in time in the series, and you can't bootstrap your data.
Yeah. Yeah, and something I didn't talk about, but as we move to fully state-based models, something like this I think becomes a lot more clear. Use my pointer here, like this. Yeah, then we do have latent values, right? We have our numbers of age are true latent values that are modeled. So that kind of makes more sense to me. But like the rigidity of these process equations, deterministic process equations, I just don't feel like those equate to latent values, and they don't induce exchangeability in our models. But I don't know.
Christine, I saw you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I'm kind of lost with the cross-validation because I've mostly used it for model selection. So I'm not clear on whether the assumptions of when you can use it depend on whether you're using them for selection versus like diagnostics. Because if you're using it for selection, I think it's important to do the leave feature out, and then you're always cutting off kind of the tail observations. But if you're just using leave one out, then I don't think you would be losing the final years of data, as Rick suggested, because then you're just removing kind of random points throughout the time series, not always the last point. But I've always used it for model selection, in which case you're trying to figure out how they predict the future, which model structure predicts the future better. So then it's clear you can't use future observations to predict, an intermediate time step.
Yeah, I think. Oh, first of all, I'm not an expert, and the math stats behind these cross validation techniques is really intense. I don't understand it. My intuition is that you are concerned about the interpretation. It's kind of like, yeah, you're concerned about the interpretation of differences in model selection if they're not exchangeable. So you have two models and you have a difference of your Lu value of 4 or 10. Like in AIC world, it's like, oh yeah, okay, that's one of them is better than the other, is preferable. But like that kind of depends on like, okay, yeah, anything more than 2 is, but like that 2 is conditioned meeting the statistical assumptions. So I think when you start to have non-exchangeability, I think the calculations are going to be fine, but it's the interpretation of how different they need to be to justify selecting one over another. And I think that's true. I think that's true for leave future out as well, but I'm not sure about that. But I think like what I've shown here is just like a standard one. You know, you're not actually leaving any data out, just to be clear. It's all done post hoc from your posterior. But yeah, I think the diagnostics are probably more interpretable than the actual like criterion value that you get out of it. Like for instance, you know, if it flags like, oh, there's a couple points that are really influential and hard to fit, and well, really what it means is hard to predict without rerunning the model and taking it out, which is what those K values mean. You know, I think that probably holds true even if they're not exchangeable, or more true. But Christine, I think you're right. I think leave future one out is probably the most common thing we're going to care about for stock assessments. Is like how well does it predict the next data point in order. And I think that's probably where we will move as a field. So let's build it in defense.
Oh, I have a question from Josh Sainer. What recommendations would you have regarding a minimalist workflow for using a Bayesian assessment within an MSE framework?
Wow, that's brave. And I guess the question is getting at where you don't have eyes on each iteration. Is that what you're getting at? Basically, you kind of have to run this analyses a little bit blind. Is that what you're getting at?
Josh, you're unmuted, so you can clarify.
Yeah, that's kind of essentially what I'm getting at, in that like if you're trying to run 535-year simulations, you have that many assessments that you're running, but you can't check each one by hand to see if, you know, to do all these checks on. So how would you either automate that, or what recommendations would you have for just having a minimalist workflow to catch the majority of issues?
I would say that the first couple here are the first three bullet points here are the same, right? You know, you have some conditioning and operating model and estimation model, and you know you would do these on your I guess the first two on your conditioning model, and then the third one on your estimation model. Or maybe you don't even need to, because you probably won't be able to run them, but you could do things. You certainly, for each of your iterations, you could track these values and divergences and flag if any of those are problematic. It's once you slow part is the slow part is integration of the model. Is getting posterior samples. Posterior predictive checks are relatively quick. So you could do something like posterior predictive checks for some key quantities and report p-value. You could summarize those as p-values. It's basically the quantile of the observed, and then look at the distribution of that. And if you have some kind of central tendency and then some weirdness out in the tails, to me that would suggest that maybe there's some convergence issues or some incompatibility with the EM and the simulated data sets. So yeah, I think that's kind of what I would do off the top of my head, but that's a brave thing to try to do. And if you do that, I wish you luck.
Yeah, I guess would you also have any recommendations? I'm at the point now where I kind of have this simulation framework set up, and it works a decent amount of the time, but then every once in a while I'll run into specific simulations in specific years that, for whatever reason, the sampling procedure takes 100 times longer than normal, and I can't isolate why that is. Do you have any guesses as to why that might be, or any analyses that can be done to try and figure that out?
Are these no U-turn sample error chains?
Yes.
Yeah, so usually that happens when one of the chains will find itself move into a space in the posterior that is has what what Michael calls a pathology. You can think of it as kind of like a sharp corner during the warm-up phase. And during the warm-up phase, if you're in a sharp corner, it's going to get stuck there potentially. And the way that it resolves that is it changes the step size to be much smaller. That's what happens when you have divergences too. Is it reacts to divergences by changing this, by shrinking the step size of the ODE integrator. And smaller step sizes mean more steps for the same trajectory, and so your tree depths are going to go higher. And so usually that's what happens is you'll have one chain that kind of gets into a region and it tunes itself to like a subset. It gets like stuck and tunes itself to a subset of the posterior, and it tunes itself into really long trajectories. And so the other chains finish, and then that one's just like creeping along. So one thing you can do in that case is I would probably run like 10 examples, and I would look at the distribution of tree depths that come out of those. And then you could, so say they're all between 3 and 5 or 5 and 7, you could set the max tree depth at 8. And then what that will do is it'll make that bad chain run faster. And you'll get a bunch of warnings because it won't be sampling properly, but at least it will finish on time. So my guess is that you could post hoc, you could look at that by just looking at the tree depths by chain. If you're doing stand, that pops up in shiny stand as well, and that would confirm that hypothesis. And then my solution would be to limit the max tree depth, set it to like 8 or 9, so that it can't wander off and do 12 2,000 times. That's way too many model evaluations.
Great, thank you.
Tim, did you want to talk?
Yeah, sorry, if I could tag on to that, and it kind of feels strongly that, and maybe Cole, you could comment on it. I would, in terms of a real management strategy evaluation, worry about using it for each future assessment. The idea of a management strategy is to base it on a plausible operating model. The power of these tools, I think, should apply there and not to future estimation models. First of all, because practicalities of it are highly unlikely to be interpretable, and the need for interventions, I think, are really great for full Bayesian analysis, and I don't think it's applicable. But I don't want to stymie your endeavor. Your name was. But I just feel really strongly about that. I'm really worried, but I do think there's a big call for evaluating management strategy where you're testing exceptional circumstances. And so I would, just caution that. Sorry.
Yeah, I don't think I would set out to do an MSc and do this on it. So I would agree with that. But to each his own.
Well, I don't have any more questions in at the moment, but Trevor and Noble will say thank you, great talk. Lychee just says, just baffled by your brilliance.
None of this is my brilliance. This is just copying text out of papers written by smart people and putting it into slides. But someone in the field's got to do it, I guess. So thanks, Lychee. Okay, well, thanks everyone. Sounds like we've exhausted our questions. We are, oh gosh, 10 over. Sorry, everyone.
Oh, Jim also says baffled by brilliance. So, Lychee, you're not alone.
Well, Lychee, you still beat me at bananagrams, so what's that say about you? Okay, thank you, Emily, for coordinating, and thanks everyone for showing up and it was a lot of material and it was really fast. So thanks for your attention, and hopefully we can push this forward and kind of come to some agreements as a field.
Thank you so much, Cole, and thank you everyone for attending. It was a really great talk, and I will end it now.